High vibes, everybody. It's TK,
And rises.
and just wanted to get on here today to make a quick video about understanding when you're going through a dip and about realizing what your dip actually is and how you can actually get out of the dip. And because there's always going to be those dips in your life that you go through, and there's going to be those situations that you come up with like throughout time that are going to make you start to lower your vibration. It's not just lowering your vibration, it's going to start actually affecting you in different ways. And when you start getting affected, like mentally, spiritually, and physically by it, that's when it'll start leading you even further down that path and even further down the path that you might not want to go down. So basically, you need to be aware. Like the awareness of the dip is the biggest thing, because if you're not aware of it, then there's no way for you to get out of it. I mean, eventually you'll get out of it regardless of whether you're aware of it or not, but you might not be at the level you were before, because there's different rises and falls with your dip, and your dip can turn into another dip, but that's for another time. But basically, you want to be aware of what's actually going on in your mind, and see what is actually happening and interplaying with the reality that's around you. Because once you're thinking about it, that's when you can start actually going into it, because your mind is residing with the ego. And I made videos about the ego and everything, and seeing how the ego manipulates and actually changes your perspective on things, and how the ego has its own perspective, which is different from what your perspective actually is. And once you're actually going through those dips and you're seeing and you're going into your mind, that actually gives you access, well, it gives your ego more access to it, because now you're in your mind where the ego resides. And you want to make sure that you're keeping your shields up and keeping that, that separation to know of, okay, that's my ego. That's what my mind's thinking. This is not what I'm actually thinking, what I'm actually doing, because, you are not your mind, and you got to realize that you're not your mind. A lot of people, start getting into how powerful your mind is, because your mind is very powerful. Like, it can do a lot of things, but you want to make sure that your mind doesn't have control over you. You have to have that control over your mind. It's not even just having control over it, not letting your mind actually affect what's going on with your life and your decisions that you're making, and seeing what you're trying to do. Because your mind and your ego, they can be very tricky. I've talked about it before, where how your ego will talk to you in a way where you think that that's how you're viewing it, because it is a part of your physicality. So therefore, it has certain things and certain information about you where it can pretty much manipulate that situation in order to be like, okay, this is what you should be thinking. This is your viewpoint, but you can't let that happen, because that's when you start getting into that dip. You start making those decisions that start leading you down that path. You might be like, okay, just for example, say you're on your no fap game, and then after a while, your mind starts being like, okay, you should fap. It's been a while. You may not have had sex. You may not have been with nobody. And your mind's like, yeah, you need to go ahead and do this. But it's different for everybody, as far as that. But you might be like, okay, I'm actually going to tune into that, because I do want to fap. I do want that physical pleasure, or I do want the feeling or the mentality that it gives me. But you got to realize, was that really the mentality that you wanted, or was it just your ego? And most of the time, it is just your ego. So you got to be able to make that clear separation with it. And Ryzen could probably touch on that a little bit more as well.
So yeah, basically, when it comes to making sure that you know the difference between you and your own actual mind, it's very important, because in today's society, people don't understand what their own mind is, or how it even operates. And you can see how people are lost. You can see how people forget things so quickly. They cannot even be aware of certain things within their own mind, and that has a yin and yang effect to it, as within so without. So if you're not aware of certain things within your mind, you're going to get a very small amount of information. And when you go out into reality or this matrix system, and if you're not like being aware of your own mind, there are things that are going to be affecting your mind outside yourself that's going to be influencing your inside source. And you can see how as within so without has that balance, and how making sure your mind will actually benefit you and actually help you when you're in certain scenarios out in reality, or civilization, whatever you want to call it. Because the mind gives terms of things, it gives symbology and different references to what we all see here, but it's all energy when it comes down to it. Even your mind is just energy. And it has a physical energy to it. So when you get in tune with your mind and you start to understand the way your ego speaks to you and how it operates, therefore you can start to tame it and be like, okay, how like TK was saying about the fapping, you may be on your no fap game and stuff, if you want to go ahead and dismiss that real quick. But you see how there's distractions. That's another thing too, because I was just talking about distractions with the mind, and you can see how like that right there, that noise that just came up on the phone could be distraction for your mind. Be like, oh, let me answer this call. But sometimes you got to pick up those spiritual calls, those one-on-ones for yourself to make sure, like, okay, am I really truly being aware of my mind and the choices that I'm making? You really got to be aware of the choices that you're making from your ego and your higher self, because your higher self, is above the mind. Yeah, the mind is powerful and everything like that, but spirit created the mind. So you got to think about the higher mind state that is beyond the mind, which is, non-physical and stuff like that. But I'm gonna leave it at that.
But yeah, so what we both were saying is, be aware of what your mind is doing, because you want to make sure that you're not living from that. You're not actually buying into all that information and that misinformation that it's actually feeding you, because once it does, that's going to lead you further into the dip. Like, so with the dips, like that's going to make you start to view everything different. It's going to change your perspective on it. And you want to not take it so hard on yourself to where it leads you further into a dip, because I've been there where you start getting into your dip and you start thinking that, oh man, this is how things are going, because you start feeding into the ego, and then the ego starts to take that control of you, and it starts to take control of your mind and everything that you're doing, because at that moment in time you're not actually aware of what's going on. You don't actually have that control of what's going to happen. And again, I'm not saying that control, but just that willpower to be like, hey, this is not what I'm trying to do. This is not what I'm actually thinking and seeing what's going on. So you got to make sure you clear out that clutter, you clear out those distractions. I made that video on distractions about how you can have healthy distractions and unhealthy distractions. So you have to be able to make that differentiation between the two before you could actually be able to start getting out of your dip. Because once you start being aware of it, which is just the first step of actually getting out of your dip and moving on, you have to be aware of what's going on in order to make any decision or any action that you actually want to change. And then once you do make that decision, now you have to see, okay, why am I in a dip, and start actually, exploring what is actually happening and what's actually going on, in real time within yourself. That's why you have to do that inner work, and you see what's going on within yourself happen outside of yourself, as Ryzen was saying. And so you want to make sure that you see all the different aspects in order to be able to get out of it. Because if you don't start becoming aware and actually taking those steps to see why you're going into a dip, it's just going to lead to the same problem again later on. And you're going to go through the same type of dip. Now, it might be a little bit different, but then it's still going to be pretty much the same cycles.
Over and over.
Exactly. Over and over and over. And you keep, winding yourself down and spiraling downward. And when you should be turning up, you should be rising up and higher. But once you start realizing the base points of why you're going through the dip and how your ego is manipulating you, then you have to make that choice. Once you make that choice to actually change it, that's when you're going to see that you're going to start getting out of your dip. You're going to start, building up that momentum again and start changing your life the way that you wanted to do. And not just your life, your spirituality, your mentality, your physicality, everything's going to start changing. You'll start seeing it on all 3 points. And then once you start seeing that, then you can start seeing the results and actually tune into that. Because you don't want to tune into the ego, you want to tune into spirit and have spirit guide you. And then once you start tuning more into spirit, then you'll start to see, okay, that dip probably wasn't even that bad. It probably wasn't even something that, should have affected you, because it's not really you that's doing that. So how can you let something that's not you affect you? These things that are happening on the outside of yourself shouldn't have any effect within yourself. You have to have that mental clarity, that mental strength, and that not only that mental, because no, that is part of the ego there. You want to make sure you have that spiritual strength and that spiritual clarity to make sure that you can have that focus to keep going on and not have these different dips start happening and not have these different things start to influence you and change how you're thinking and how you're doing things. So you want to make sure that you're doing all the steps and doing all the processes that you need to do in order to keep rising up and getting out of the dip. But I think that's pretty much all.
Definitely that we're going to pretty much say. Oh, there's one thing I do want to add real quick.
Okay.
Going back to the will, and actually having that will inside yourself. I think a lot of people, today in today's society, people are a lot more weaker. They don't have a lot of strength within themselves. And you can see how, like, the programs have made men more, docile to, like, be more, less stronger than what they used to. Because you think back in the day when we were, like, cavemen and shit like that. Well, not really caveman, but, you get my point, I hope. Males had more dominant energy inside of them. They had more, will to do certain things. Even the females had more will than they do now. And you can see how they've, had these things for women, like, empower women and stuff, but if you, I'm not trying to put down women or anything like that, but there's balance for everything. There's a reason why there's male energy and there's female energy in this world, and having certain willpower within you to define yourself from your ego, especially when you go through dips. When you're going through a dip, you got to make sure that you have that will inside yourself to be like, okay, actually ask yourself the questions and be like, is this something that's really truly myself or my ego? You got to have that will to pull through, even through the dips. Even if you're going through something low in your life, you got to be able to be like, what, I'm not gonna let this dip affect me. I'm gonna continue to rise, because I know that if I allow myself to keep going through these dips, I'm gonna lower myself. But if you have that willpower to keep on rising, you're gonna keep on rising, and that goes hand in hand. So make sure that you have that will of fire inside of yourself and really turn up. But that's all that's all we wanted to say. But my full love
full love
and our gratitude.
Gratitude.